Welcome back to the YouTube channel of the Buddhist Audio Bookshelf. Today, we're delving deeper into the profound insights of meditation by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, also known as Geoffrey DeGraff. Your support means the world to us. We kindly ask you to like and share this audiobook, thus expanding its reach and allowing more people to benefit from its wisdom. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so that you receive immediate notifications when new content is uploaded. Together, we can spread the teachings of meditation and mindfulness, cultivating a community dedicated to enlightenment and inner tranquility. We are sincerely grateful for your involvement in our mission to make these transformative teachings universally accessible. Let's now begin today's reading. Filling in the Buddha's outline. January 4, 2019. We're working on a set of skills here that are meant to solve a problem. Why is it that everything we do is for the sake of happiness, but we often end up causing pain and suffering? The Buddha gives two big frameworks for approaching this problem. In fact, they're his only teachings that he says are categorical, in other words, true across the board, all the time, in all situations. One is that unskillful behavior should be abandoned, and skillful behavior should be developed. The other is the Four Noble Truths, going into the unskillful behavior in the mind that's causing suffering, and then seeing what kind of skillful behavior we can develop in its place, so that we can bring suffering to an end. That's basically the big framework for the problem. Now, the framework tells you a lot. The Buddha is saying that suffering comes from our actions, and particularly from unskillful actions of the mind. The unskillful craving and clinging can be brought to an end by developing actions that crave and cling in a different, more skillful way. Crave to have right view, right resolve, all the way down through right mindfulness and right concentration. That's a kind of craving, too, but it's a good one. There has to be the desire to develop the path. Otherwise, the path doesn't happen. The rest of the Buddha's teachings basically give more detail on those issues. And, as he said, in some cases the detail is true across the board, in other cases, it really depends on the situation. Across the board, the Buddha says no killing, no stealing, no illicit sex, no lying, no harsh speech, no divisive speech, no idle chatter, trying to avoid greed that goes out of bounds. Of course, that raises the question, what are the bounds? The bounds start with any greed that would require that you do things that are against the precepts in order to get what you want. The Buddha also says, across the board, to avoid ill will, in other words, wanting to see other people suffer, and to avoid wrong view. The wrong view that your actions don't make any difference, that generosity isn't worthwhile, that gratitude isn't worthwhile, that nobody knows what happens after death, so who cares? Those are things you have to avoid across the board. As you get into the Four Noble Truths, especially when you get into the Noble Eightfold Path, there are specific instructions on how to get the mind into concentration by being mindful, but by and large those truths provide a pretty large outline with lots of spaces. In those spaces, the Buddha indicates where some problems might be, or where things might evolve into problems. Sometimes the mind is too sluggish, sometimes too restless, but to see precisely what the problems are, you have to read the situation for yourself. The Ajahns often talk about taking a survey of your mind when you sit down, and before you focus on the breath. In what direction is the mind headed? Is it sleepy? Is it drowsy? There are ways of counteracting that. If you find that a particular topic puts you to sleep, change the topic. If you're focused on the breath, try changing the way that you breathe, or changing to another topic, something that engages the mind more, such as the contemplation of the body or goodwill. Get up, walk around, do something to stir your juices a little bit, to wake yourself up. If you already have some concentration, think of the awareness filling the body down to every little cell. Explore the parts of the body that you don't usually pay attention to, say, the areas between the toes or between the fingers. In other words, do something to make the breath interesting and to develop a full body awareness. That can be energizing. These are things you have to play around with, because each person's situation is different. This is why the Buddha gives such large outlines where there are spaces for you to fill in. Your situation today may differ from your situation tomorrow, and your situation right here, right now, may differ from the situation of the person sitting right next to you. So, look and see what you need right now. If the mind is restless, it needs to be steadied. First, remind yourself that the worries you're restless about are not going to accomplish anything. All too often, we're restless because we're worried about something in the future or about some situation in the present moment. Remind yourself that your worrying is not going to solve the problem. The problem gets solved by developing qualities of alertness, mindfulness, ardency, concentration, and discernment. The things that we're supposed to work on as we meditate. So, if you want to solve the problem, it's often good to work on these skills first, right here. The skills themselves may not solve the problem on their own as you meditate, but they give you the skill set you're going to need when you actually have to start thinking about the problem. Meanwhile, you can breathe in a way that calms you down. You have to read the situation to see what needs to be done. This involves getting a sense of the right time and the right place for things, which is a concept that the Buddha emphasizes many times. Say, with the factors for awakening. Some factors for awakening are energizing, rapture, effort, taking an analytical attitude toward what's going on in the mind. Those factors can wake you up. Taking an analytical attitude toward what's going on in the body. That'll wake you up, too. Other factors are more calming. Focusing on the parts of the body that seem more calm and getting the mind more concentrated, developing an attitude of equanimity. So you've got to read the situation. What's needed right now? The Buddha makes a comparison with trying to get a fire going. If the fire is too strong, you've got to put ashes on it. If it's too weak, you've got to put more fuel in. He makes a similar observation with the basis for success. Sometimes your desire's too strong, sometimes it's not enough. In other words, it's not focused on the right thing. You're supposed to be focused on the causes, and as for your desires for the results at the end, you can put them aside. You know that they're there, but you don't focus on them. You focus on what you've got to do. The same with the other bases of success, like persistence. Your efforts may be too much, too little. The focus of your intent may be too narrow or too broad, and your analysis may be too much or too little. So you've got to figure out what's right for here right now, and the results will be the means by which you judge what's right for here right now. In other words, what happens as a result will tell you whether your efforts are right or wrong for the situation. This is why evaluation plays such an important role in the meditation. You do something and you look at the results. Are they good enough? If you're not sure, just keep doing what you're doing until the results becomes clear. If they're not right, then you can change. This is how your discernment develops. Sometimes you hear that tranquility meditation is one thing and insight meditation is something else, but the Buddha never taught it that way. He said to do concentration, and that it's going to require a certain amount of tranquility and a certain amount of insight to get into jhana. Where does the insight come in? It comes in seeing the connections between what you're doing and the results you're getting, and judging them as to whether they're good enough. And your sense of what's good enough should develop over time. You see if there's any disturbance in the mind, it's a potential problem. Ask yourself, to what extent am I contributing to that? That's actually applying the Four Noble Truths to a very immediate problem. The Four Noble Truths are not objects that you put up on a table and worship. They're tools for analyzing problems, and the problem here is this: something's weighing down the mind. The Four Noble Truths teach you to ask yourself, what are you doing that's contributing to that? They keep focusing you back on your actions, and that's the kind of knowledge that, while we're doing the meditation, counts as real knowledge. Other kinds of knowledge can be very detailed, but if they don't fall into that framework, what are you doing? What could you be doing that can put an end to suffering? They count as ignorance as far as the Buddha's concerned, particularly with regard to this problem that we're trying to solve. A lot of the practice is like developing any skill. If you're a carpenter and you're planing a piece of wood, how much pressure do you put on it? How much is too much? How much is too little? You learn from doing. When you're cooking, how much salt is too much? How much is too little? You learn from doing, keeping in mind a basic principle that if there's a problem, you want to look back on your own actions. Now, this doesn't mean that other people are not creating problems for you, but the big problem that you can solve is, why do your actions create suffering? That's the problem that's really worth pursuing. The same principle applies in daily life. You have to look at your actions. Here again you go back to the precepts, you go back to the Buddha's basic teachings on what he calls the 10 guidelines. No killing, no stealing, no illicit sex, no lying, no harsh speech, no divisive speech, no idle chatter, no inordinate greed, no ill will, and avoiding wrong views. That's the basic outline, but there are lots of things not covered by the outline. The outline is a sketch with big blank areas, and those are the areas where you have to use your own judgment. Again, the judgment is based on, what am I doing that's leading to unnecessary problems for the mind, and how can I stop? As you go out into daily life, do you spend all your time meditating? No. To what extent do you deal with other people? How much of that is too much? That's something you have to find out for yourself. But notice, the way to judge it is, what impact is it having on your mind? Ajahn Fuang was once talking about how some people go out into the world, and they try to do so much to help the world that ultimately their goodness breaks, as he put it, and they totally give up. They have no energy anymore. That's a sign that they haven't been watching themselves all along. You have to know how to watch yourself and notice, in this case, I'm getting too involved. I've got to pull back. In this case, more needs to be done right now. There are no hard and fast rules, but there is that basic principle. Look at what you're doing and what you can change in what you're doing. In some cases, there are things happening in the world that you cannot change, tasks that you have to take on, regardless of what you may think you would like to take on. There is work that has to be done and you do it. You have to train yourself to be up to doing it. Ajahn Fuang, every now and then, would spring work projects on us. At the end of the meal, he would come in and say, okay, today we're going to do X, and sometimes X would require the entire day. One time it went from 8 a.m. to 4 a.m., working on a cement pouring. At times like that, you'd have to tell yourself, okay, I've got to forget totally about my plans for a meditation schedule today. I've just got to do what needs to be done. And so you do it. But while you're doing it, you try to develop what inner strength you can. Think of your meditation. Think of your breath and what you've learned about making the breath energized inside. Give the mind a good place where it can stay. After all, even when you're doing work, how much of your attention really is on the work? Take the part that's ordinarily not on your work and devote it to the breath. Some jobs require 100% of your attention, so you give them 100% of your attention. Others, though, require maybe 30% or 20%, so give the remaining 70% or 80% to the breath, so that your mind can have a place where it can nourish itself and gain some sustenance. Remember, though, that not all of the skills of the practice are related to meditation. Some of them have to do with the other perfections you can develop. Qualities like endurance, patience, determination, goodwill. To develop these qualities is also part of the practice. Remind yourself of the teaching about the acrobats. The Buddha tells the story of two acrobats, one standing on the top of a bamboo pole and the other standing on top of his shoulders. The one below tells the one above, okay, you look out after me and I'll look out after you, and that way we'll get down from the pole safely. But the other one says, no, that's not going to work. I'll look out after myself, you look out after yourself, and that way we'll get down from the pole safely. The Buddha said in that particular case the person on top was right. If you maintain your balance, it helps other people maintain theirs. But he added that there are also cases where looking out after another person helps with your practice. When you're kind, when you show patience, when you develop equanimity and goodwill in your dealings with other people, that strengthens the goodness of your mind. This is an important principle. We have to remember that this skill we're practicing here is not just a technique. It involves a lot of the qualities that we would call qualities of a good heart. We live in a culture where a good heart is not really prized. You hear of people called captains of industry, captains of government. Well, they didn't rise to those positions out of a good heart. So in this way the practice has to be countercultural. You have to stand outside of the culture a bit. But then there is a part of every human culture that does value a good heart, so you're still in tune with that part of the culture. Buddhism emphasizes the good heart as much as possible because basically that's what the desire to put an end to suffering comes down to. You want to find happiness in a way that doesn't harm anybody. That's a good-hearted desire. You want to find a happiness that's really worthwhile, in other words, that will last. That's a good-hearted desire, too. What the Buddha is offering is a large framework for approaching the question of how to maintain that good heart and get good results. Once you've got the larger framework, seeing that even though other people may be contributing to the problem that's causing your suffering can be traced back to your actions. Once you've got that framework in mind, you keep looking back to your actions. If you don't like the results you're getting right now, go back and change what you're doing. Look again. Make changes again. That's how you learn. You gain a sense of when's the right time for engaging with other people, when's the right time for meditating, and when you're meditating, what's the right time to work on developing more energy in the practice, what time is the right time to be more analytical in the practice, what time is the time to be more still. With practice, you gain a sense of these things. The Buddha has offered you the framework for knowing what to look for, along with a range of skills to apply, to help you figure out what is the problem right now, and what you should do right now. He's not leaving you to keep reinventing the Dhamma wheel all the time, but he does expect you to use your powers of discernment, your powers of observation. Otherwise, if everything were all laid out, insert tab A into slot B, where everything is pre-cut and all you have to do is assemble it, it'd be a foolproof practice, but you'd still be a fool. There's no foolproof way to awakening. We may be foolish as we start, but part of the practice is to teach us how to be more sensitive, more wise, more alert to what's the right time, what's the right place. That's how discernment develops, and it's through discernment that we overcome our foolishness and the problem gets solved. Comfortable as an outsider. December 28, 2019. We suffer largely because of the way we talk to ourselves. That's what the message of the Four Noble Truths is all about. It's not that we suffer from sights, sounds, smells, tastes, or tactile sensations. We suffer because of the commentary we apply to these things. And a lot of meditation is learning to talk to yourself in new ways. In fact, the whole practice is about talking to yourself in new ways, asking new questions, and when you ask new questions, you get new answers. How do you create suffering for yourself? What are the steps? What are the steps in the path away from the suffering? What do you have to relearn? What old habits should you keep? What new habits do you have to develop? These are questions best asked when you're alone, talking to yourself. The problem is that we don't always live alone. We very rarely have time alone now in the modern world. Our space is invaded, our minds are invaded. This has always been the case with every domestic culture where people try to domesticate you so that you live nicely within the culture. Even in societies where they have rites of passage where people go out alone into the wilderness, they have very set ideas of what you're supposed to find there. You're going to be looking for a totem animal or spirit guide. Whatever message you gain, they'll have their ways of incorporating it back into the regular beliefs of society. One of the things that's radical about the Dhamma is that a large part of it is not domesticated. It's a wilderness Dhamma. The Buddha was able to straddle wilderness and civilization, but his time in the wilderness was what enabled him to get away from the questions of his civilization and see that they were the wrong questions. The hot topics of the time were: what are you? Do you have a self? Do you not have a self? Or how about the nature of the world? Is it eternal? Is it not eternal? Who made it? Did somebody make it? That kind of thing. It drove some of his contemporaries crazy that, when the Buddha was teaching, he wouldn't answer these questions. He asked another set of questions entirely. It was by holding to that alternative set of questions that he was not sucked back into his society after his awakening. This is something you'll have to learn how to protect. This ability to be with yourself even when you're with other people and not get sucked into their issues. Part of it's realizing that a lot of people are asking the wrong questions and trying to get you involved in the wrong questions. To the extent that you have to live with other people, work with other people, you do have to take on some of their questions, but you have to take them on with a sense of being disjoined from them. A Dhamma practitioner's always something of an outsider. Learning how to practice both on your own and with other people means becoming comfortable with both roles. It takes time and it takes determination. Because a lot of us don't like being outsiders. We want to fit in. I found this to be true during my time in Thailand. We had a lot of work projects around the monastery. Ajahn Fuang was really good about not forcing me to get involved, but there were times when I had to. This meant we had to work together on a project, talk together about the project, and we could bond around the project. But he was always very careful to make sure that I didn't bond more than that. Of course, the fact that I came from a different culture meant that as I got to know some of the other people in areas outside of the project, whatever the project was, usually construction of some kind, I began to realize that these were people I never would have connected with outside of that particular context. I looked at some of the values in their daily life and I told myself, I'm glad I don't have to get further involved with them. But in order to maintain that stance as a comfortable outsider, you have to get comfortable inside your own skin, comfortable with your practice. Otherwise, you feel that you're the only person making yourself miserable this way, cutting yourself off from others. There's a great passage in the canon where a monk is meditating in the forest, and his meditation isn't going well. He hears the villagers off in the distance having a nighttime festival, and he's thinking about how miserable he is, and how at least they know how to make themselves happy. Then a diva appears to him and says, "Do you realize how many people envy you right now? All those beings who are going to go to hell, they see you going in the opposite direction." The monk came to his senses and realized that what he was doing was really worthwhile. Now, we don't have divas coming to talk to us that way, so we have to learn how to talk to ourselves in that way. This is one of the reasons why we have Dhamma talks online. And it's a reason why we recommend chanting before you meditate. It helps get you out of the issues of daily life, so that when you sit down to practice, you come with a different perspective. We have the chance on the different parts of the body to gain a sense of distance from the concerns of the body, the concerns of consuming, reflections on aging, illness, and death, and the fact that our actions are our only possessions, reflections on goodwill, compassion, empathetic joy, equanimity. We develop the right attitudes toward the people around us. We wish them well, but we realize that wishing them well often means we have to go our separate ways. All these reflections are there so that you can create a mental space for your meditation, convinced of its importance and being okay with the fact that it's somewhat cut off. Because when you look at the craziness of the world, you realize you really do want to be insulated from it. Some people will say you're running away, but that's the whole point. Samsara tries to suck you in, and all too often we're willing to be sucked in, to play along. Our lives get frittered away by things totally irrelevant. So we have to take charge. This is one of the reasons why it's so good that out meditation method is proactive. It reminds you that you do have a large role in shaping your environment. And you want to take advantage of the fact that you have the power, to at least some extent, to shape things. There are so many meditation methods that tell you, don't do anything. Just accept things as they are. Last night I was reading a little piece on the attitudes you should bring to mindfulness practice, and one of them, according to the author, is that nothing needs to be changed, nothing needs to be fixed. You have to be convinced that you're beautiful as you are. That's what the author said. But after meditating that way for a long time, you'll begin to feel helpless. That you shouldn't be trying to fix anything, that you shouldn't be trying to help anything. It's like those dogs in the learned helplessness experiment. First they were placed in a room where, no matter where they lay down on the floor, they were getting electric shocks. After being subjected to that for a while, they were moved into another room where half the floor would still give them electric shocks, and half the floor would not. The researchers would drag the dogs from one half to the other so that they could see the difference, but by that point the dogs had given up. They were convinced there was nothing they could do to avoid the shocks, so they just lay wherever they happened to be. A lot of meditation methods are like that, teaching you that there's nothing you can do, so you might as well accept that fact. But that wasn't the Buddha's approach. Look at his meditation instructions for breath meditation. They're all about intentionally breathing in certain ways to induce certain mental states and certain physical states. You can be aware of the whole body with a sense of well-being throughout the whole body, calming the effect of the breath on the mind, calming your perceptions. These are things you can do. So when you find yourself getting discouraged or getting pulled into the questions of the world, remind yourself, what are the questions the Buddha would have you ask? Where is your suffering right now? How can you change what you're doing so as not to create that suffering? Because it is something you're doing. The cause is something you're doing, the suffering itself is something you do. Why keep on doing it? It's not necessary. So find ways to remind yourself of the importance of this question and how you don't want your time frittered away. As for the sense of feeling a little bit estranged, remind yourself that it's good to get away from crazy society. Every domestic society is crazy in its own way. You're doing something that the noble ones would approve of, so keep them in mind. You're not totally alone. Many other good people are following this path. Back in the days of the Roman Empire, the Stoics, who lived scattered around the empire, considered themselves members of what they called the cosmopolis. Polis meant city, cosmo, of course, meant cosmic. The cosmic city. The idea was that this particular city was not determined by where you were, it was determined by what you respected. If you respected reason, you were a member of the Stoic cosmopolis wherever you were. In the same way, when you respect the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha, when you respect your ability to find true happiness, that makes you part of the cosmopolis of the Buddha's Parissa, the following of the Buddha. Those who are asking the questions the Buddha asked, looking for the answers inside themselves. So as you repeat the chants at night, remember that people all around the world are repeating them. There are people actually practicing in line with the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, taking refuge not only in the external Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, but also in the triple gem on the inner level. The qualities of the practice, developing right mindfulness. Taking refuge in things that are unchanging, things that are free from conditions. This means that you want to learn how not to let yourself be overwhelmed by the conditions of having people around you, and how to keep your internal conversations somewhat separate from the conversations outside. This means that when you're working together with others, you talk about things that are necessary to talk about. But watch out for conversations that stray away from things that are of genuine worth. You may become a person of few words, but what's wrong with that? As long as your few words are good words, they're a contribution to others. They may be few, but they're valuable. Part of your own training in gaining some control over your mind is to ask the question, where does the suffering come from? It's coming from within. What can I do to put an end to it? You're learning the skills. That's what matters. There's something undomesticated about those questions and those answers. And if they set you apart, they set you apart in a good way. A rite of passage. December 10, 2018. One of the things our culture lacks is a serious rite of passage. A time when you can go off, be by yourself, delve down inside. You start sorting out the things you learned as a child on your way to adulthood, trying to see which things you're going to carry into adulthood and which you're going to leave behind. It's almost as if our culture's afraid to have people do that, for fear of what they might see. Our minds are so connected now through the media, and there's a strong sense that if you're not participating in the general culture, there's something wrong with you. We have very little room for genuine dissent, very little room for real independence. Meditation, though, is one activity that you can do that gives you some of that freedom, gives you some of that time to yourself. In a lot of cultures, they want you to go out and have a vision quest and gain a vision maybe of your totem animal or some symbol that the culture recognizes. The Buddha's rite of passage is a lot more radical than that. It calls everything into question. In particular, he found an answer to the question that deals very deeply with our relationship to the society around us. To what extent does your personal happiness have to make way for the needs of society? To what extent is it really detrimental to society for people to go off and find happiness in their own ways? And to what extent does your personal happiness have to be in conflict with others? The Buddha found that it is possible to find a genuine happiness that doesn't harm anybody. The fact that he gained awakening never harmed anybody, even though, when he came back to teach, a lot of his teachings were not pleasing to people who weren't willing to change their ideas. So, it's not the case that he came up with an answer that pleased everybody, but he came up with an answer that didn't harm anyone. At the same time, it brought him to the ultimate happiness. So, we look at his example and say, if he can do it, why can't we? This is what we're doing as we meditate. Giving the mind a place where it can set itself apart, not only from people outside, that's called physical seclusion, but also from the people inside our minds. That's called mental seclusion. We have all these different voices in our mind that we've picked up from other people, our parents, our teachers, our friends, our enemies, the media, and it's a real jumble. It's good to have some time away physically, so that you can get off by yourself, and then give yourself a place to stay in the mind, so that you can step out of the thoughts, step out of the voices. This is one of the reasons why we work with the breath. It's the closest thing to the mind that's not a thought. Among the various elements or properties of the body, the breath is the most immediately present to your awareness. We tend to think of the body as being a solid lump that we're aware of, and the breath as something we have to pull into the lump. Actually, though, breath is what lets you know that there's solidity there to begin with. It's right there next to the mind. It gives you a place where you can stand a little bit outside of the mind, outside of your thoughts, and yet be close enough that you can watch them. That's part of the Buddha's rite of passage, giving you this place. So explore your breath. Learn to see which kinds of breathing feel good, which kinds of breathing don't feel good, which ways of picturing the breath to yourself are helpful, and which ways are not, and how you can breathe in a way that really is blissful. One of the tricks is making sure that you don't squeeze the end of the breath in as you change to the breath out. Try to think of the in-breath flowing into the out-breath, the out-breath flowing back into the in-breath. In other words, let the breath do the breathing. You don't have to use the solid parts of the body to do the breathing, or even worse, you don't have to let the pains do the breathing. When you're aware of the pains in the body and not much else, then as you breathe in, it feels like the painful areas are the ones actually doing the work. Think of breath as being an energy cocoon that's in the body and a little bit outside the body as well. Its boundaries are not all that clearly defined. The quality of this cocoon is that it breathes in, breathes out, expands, contracts. But it's all one cocoon. Try to hold that perception in mind and see if it helps you settle down and, at the very least, helps you get into the kind of concentration the Buddha taught, which is to have a full body awareness. If you can see the breath as being simply air coming in and out through the nose, it's hard to relate that to the whole body. But if you realize that breath is an energy flow, that it's an aspect of the wind property, then you realize that it's everywhere in the body. So, let the breath do the breathing. You can nudge it to make it longer, shorter, deeper, more shallow, whatever feels good for the body right now, whatever the body needs. Try to do this in a way that allows you to feel like you're settling in, because one of the important aspects of getting the mind into right concentration is that you give it a place where you can stay for long periods of time and not feel that you have to move. We're not here to jump through jhana hoops, where we have to say, spend 7 minutes in the first jhana, now 7 minutes in the second. Stay right here. Your relationship to the breath will develop as you stay right here, as will your relationship to the feelings that come with the breath. feelings of ease, feelings of fullness, rapture, or refreshment. As long as they feel refreshing, stay with them. When they begin to seem a little bit too much, then you think of a more subtle level of energy in the body, a more subtle level of breath. It's there. Focus in on that and let the movements of the rapture or the refreshment or whatever take care of themselves. Now, thoughts will come up as you're doing this. In the beginning, all you have to do is tell yourself, they're not part of this process right now. They're not relevant to what you're doing. Sometimes they'll be really insistent, and you'll have to think a little bit about them to get rid of them. But try to think about them in ways that can untangle you from them as quickly as possible. Remind yourself that you're trying to get in touch with a level of awareness that really doesn't have a history. It doesn't have stories. We have our stories about what happened to us when we were young, what may have happened to us before we were born. But there's an aspect of awareness that doesn't have those stories, doesn't have to carry them around. Try to get in touch with that aspect of your awareness. Anything that comes up that reminds you of who you are or what's happening in your life, you say, this is not relevant right now. Try to find something timeless. Let that be the thought that helps to extricate you. If that doesn't work, you can try other ways of thinking about what's happened to you in the past in terms of karma. Think about the vast expanses of time during which karma has gone back and forth. You've been victim and victimizer who knows how many times. Whatever helps give you a perspective on your thoughts and allows you to put them aside so that you can settle in here and have a real sense of feeling at home. Then, when you can stay here, you get to the second step in the rite of passage, which is to allow some of those thoughts back in. What's different is that now they're in your territory. You're not wandering out into theirs. That's a big difference. There's an image in the canon of monkeys wandering out of their territory and getting into areas where hunters have laid traps. They get caught by the traps, skewered, and carried off. But if they stay in their own territory, the areas where the hunters can't go, they're safe. If you're thinking of yourself out in the world, or thinking of yourself in terms of the identity that the world has given you, and that you've adopted while participating in the pleasures you get from the world, that's where the hunters can get you. But if you have this sense of belonging right here in the present moment with your awareness filling the body, your sense of the breath energy filling the body, a sense of ease filling the body, this is your territory. And now when thoughts come in here, they're here on your terms. Ajahn Chah has a nice image. He says it's as if you have a house where there's one chair. As long as you're sitting in the chair, whoever else comes into the house has to stand and is subject to your orders as to what they have to do. If you leave the chair or leave the house, they can get you. You're in their territory. But if the thoughts are coming into your territory, then you can ask yourself, okay, where does this thought lead? Does it lead to my true happiness, or does it lead away? Remind yourself that true happiness is going to be harmless. It's not a selfish thing. It comes from developing your internal resources in a way where you become more generous, more virtuous, wiser. It's all to the good. Then you can start questioning all the other voices that pull in other directions and say, what do they know? For me, that was one of the big turnarounds in my practice while I was in Thailand. I was practicing meditation and it was during the Vietnam War. You could hear the bombers going overhead. 3 a.m. every morning they were on their way to drop bombs in Vietnam and Cambodia. I kept thinking, here I am, just focusing on my own breath, being very selfish. But I began to realize that the voices in my head that I'd come to identify with were voices I'd picked up from different people. This voice was the voice of my mother, that voice was the voice of my father, telling me I shouldn't be doing this. I had to realize, what do they know of this? This is an area where they've never been. And don't think that this applies just to people who are raised in countries that aren't Buddhist. Ajahn Fuang had plenty of students who were getting a lot of flack from their parents for practicing. Generally, in Thai society, it's okay to go to the monastery, to go to the temples and make merit. But if you're actually meditating, you're getting a little bit out of your parents' control. So, Ajahn Fuang had to teach his Thai students, you've got to ask yourself, what do they know? The fact that you're finding a happiness they don't understand bothers them. It doesn't fit into their worldview. You have to ask yourself, are you going to let yourself be a prisoner of their worldview, or are you going to get out? If getting out meant that you were going to be ungrateful, ungenerous, that would be a bad thing. But this is not the case. While I was sorting through the thoughts I had picked up from my parents, Ajahn Fuang kept reminding me, you've got to have gratitude for what they have done, the good things they've done for you. So, it's not just a simple rebellion where you've been taught A all your life, and now you're just going to rebel by holding on to not A. There are lots of different things you have to sort out. Getting the mind into concentration gives you a place where you can do this sorting with full alertness, full awareness. As you keep doing it, your discernment grows as well. Remind yourself that you're motivated by compassion, both for yourself and for others, and that you're happy to have found a path that allows you to find true happiness without having to harm anyone at all. A lot of Western psychology is built on the idea that, on the one hand, you've got your desires for happiness, which are pretty wild and untamable. On the other hand, you've got the strictures of society that tell you what you've got to do, and they have very little to do with your true happiness. A lot of them serve what society thinks is in its own best interest. And you're caught between those two impulses. But the Buddha says no. He's got a different set of shoals that really are for your true happiness. Even though your desires for happiness may be uncontrollable in some areas, they've got one basic idea right. That happiness is a good thing. The next step is to ask yourself, how do you find a true happiness, a happiness that's not going to change? That's when you have to learn how to be a little bit wiser, more compassionate, more alert to your actions and the results of your actions, so that what you actually do and say and think is in line with your ideals. That's the quality that the Buddha calls purity. So, wisdom, compassion, purity, these are the qualities of the Buddha. These are qualities that come from practicing this rite of passage aimed at true happiness. It's not a rite of passage where all bets are off and anything can happen. There is a direction to this. It's not like we're just getting into the present moment and saying, well, wherever the present moment is going to lead me, that's fine. We're doing this because we have a very clear idea of what we want. A true happiness, a harmless happiness. That ideal will get even clearer as we finally discover that such a thing is possible, and that we're capable of doing it. So, the choice is yours if you want to take on this goal. But it's a really good one. I can't think of anything in the world that would be better. The current news. March 18, 2019. I had a student once who told me that his version of checking the morning news was to go out into his garden and check on what was growing, what was blooming, what was dying. I had to tell him that even that was too far afield. The important news is what's going on in your mind right now. What are you doing? What are you saying? What are you thinking? Why? What's the motivation? This is the news that's really important for us, because it's what we're responsible for. Yet all too often we don't exercise our full responsibility here. We pay attention to other things. We let the news of the world outside coming through the media invade our attention, to the point where we really don't know what we're doing or why. So, it's good when you meditate to remind yourself that this is the news you should be current with. Each time the breath comes in, what are you doing? Each time the breath goes out, what are you doing? Are you with the breath or are you someplace else? If there's something coming up in the mind, do you see it clearly? Here's an area where you can exercise some power, some control. There's so much in the outside news over which we have no control at all. And it's frustrating to have knowledge about things we can't do anything about. On top of that, we let ourselves get worked up about the news of other people. Instead, we should be getting worked up about the fact that greed, aversion, and delusion are taking charge of our own mind, and yet we're not doing anything about it, or our efforts are half-hearted. You want to give full attention to what's happening right here, because right here is where you're responsible, and this is where you can make a difference. As you sit here focusing on the breath, you can ask yourself, what would be the best way to breathe right now? Unlike the news outside, This isn't anything you can discuss as a topic of conversation with your friends. I had a really great breath last night. But it is important for your internal well-being right now. That's because the mind needs a place in the present moment where it can settle down. If it's going to see itself clearly, it has to stay anchored in the present. The breath is good for that, both because it's always in the present moment, there's no future breath, no past breath that you can watch right now, and because you can make the breath comfortable. That helps the mind be willing to stay here. If there's a sense of ease in the body, try to spread it around. Think of it filling the whole body. Think of the breath bathing the body and of good energy filling the body along with the breath. When we talk about the breath being full, it's not a matter of lots of air in your lungs. It's more a sense of fullness in your blood vessels, fullness in your nerves. That's a feeling you want to be able to maintain even as you're breathing out. It may give rise to a sense of floating. As long as that feels good, keep it up. When you're with the breath, you don't stop there. You ask yourself, what's going on in the mind? Don't try to stir things up, just keep an eye out for it. This is what alertness is for, to be not only with the breath, but also with the mind. That way, if anything's going to come in and invade, you see it. And you begin to see the stages by which you get involved in the thought, and how the thought goes out into a desire to do something. It's something you want to see, because the mind plays a lot of tricks on itself as it goes from just a stirring to a decision to do something. All too often those stages are totally hidden from us because we've got our attention someplace else. Someone once told me that her approach to watching the news was always to ask, someone wants me to believe this. Why? In other words, you have to bring a sense of skepticism, you have to wonder about the motives and agendas of other people. And you can never really know. Well, you've got to bring the same attitude toward your own motivations. Something inside me says to do this. Why? Here's something you actually can know. You can look into your motivation. What is the agenda? Is it an agenda you'd like to continue with? This way the news is current, and you're on top of something where you can make a change. That's the most useful news of all. The Buddha once said that his test for anything he would say was threefold. Is it true? Is it beneficial? And is this the right time and place? You can apply those same questions to your thoughts. Something comes in. Is this true? If it's not true, why bother? And when you say it's true, based on what do you think it's true? So much of the news is hearsay. It may be guaranteed from many different sources, but it's still something you just hear about, it's just a report. Yet we base so many of our opinions on reports like that. As the Buddha points out, there's so little you can really trust in reports. They may be right, they may be wrong. You don't really know. But the truth that you see while you meditate is the truth of what's going on in your mind, whether it's giving rise to pleasure or pain. That's something you can trust a lot more. But even then, if something's true, that's not enough. The next question is it beneficial? In other words, can you do something useful with that knowledge? Something that really is for your benefit and for the benefit of others? Finally, is this the right time and the right place? You could spend the hour thinking about lots of good things you could do tomorrow which could be true and beneficial, but this is not the right time. Right now you've got the opportunity to get the mind really quiet so that you can see clearly inside what's going on. Take the opportunity while it's there. The Buddha's image for seeing things clearly is of standing by a clear pool of water where you can see the fish moving around, and you know which fish is doing what because the water is so clear. That's the clarity you want to have in your mind. Yet for so many of us, our minds are not a clear pool of water. They're all pretty murky. Every now and then something seems to show its head out of the murk, but the question is, what lies further down in the murk? You've got to make the water clear. You do this by looking at your actions. When you do something, look at the intention beforehand, look at the action while you're doing it, to see what results you're getting while you're doing it, and then look at the results over the long term. To see the long term requires not only clarity but also mindfulness. The ability to remember what you did. This is one of the reasons why we practice not only being with the present moment, but also developing mindfulness and alertness and ardency. Keeping in mind the lessons we've learned from the past as to what's useful and what's not, being alert to what's actually going on. And trying to do this as best we can for the sake of good results now and into the future. Is your mind staying with the breath or is it wandering off? If it's wandering off, bring it back. That's part of the ardency. While you're with the breath, ardency tries to be as sensitive as possible to how the breathing feels and how the mind's relating to the breath. When you bring all these qualities to bear, that clears the water so you can see precisely what's going on. We hear about the unconscious or the subconscious as if it were a separate room in the mind. Actually, it's just actions happening in the mind, right below the surface, but we're not paying attention to them. When the water's clear, we can see them clearly. As meditators, we want to be investigative reporters, to look into what's really going on, to see how many layers there are in your intentions, and which ones you can trust. These are things that you can learn, skills that you can master. It's an area of your experience where you can make a difference for sure. You're the one in charge. In fact, you're the only one who knows how you feel the mind from within, how you feel your breath from within. So here's your chance to make your eyewitness report to the person who's responsible for making changes. And try to cultivate the desire that you really want to make the changes for the better. You want to be as skillful as possible in what you do, able to rely on yourself as much as you can. Because all those reports that come from the world outside may be interesting right now, but as you get older, as death approaches, they won't be able to do much for you at all. The skills you've learned in watching your own mind, those are the things that will come in handy, that will really help you, so that whatever thought or emotion flares up in the mind, you know how to handle it because you've learned the skill now, because you've been on top of things now. You've paid careful attention to the news inside your mind right now. That way, when death becomes something happening right now, or a very strong pain becomes something happening right now, you won't be in unfamiliar territory. You'll know the area because you've watched it, and you've dug down to see what's really going on right here. That means you'll be in a position of strength, the strength that comes from being current with what you're doing and what the results are. It's through those two things that everything else you know in the world gets filtered. So be very clear about how you engage with your senses, how you make up your mind to do or say or think something, because everything else you know gets filtered through those decisions. When you're clear here, everything important becomes clear. A concentration diet. October 9, 2019. There's a series of questions and answers that the Buddha used to teach the Dhamma to young novices. It starts with, what is one? What is two? What is three? And it goes all the way up to, what is 10? For example, what is 4? The 4 Noble Truths. What is 5? The 5 Aggregates. 8. The Noble Eightfold Path. The most interesting answer, though, is the answer to, what is 1? And that is, all beings subsist on food. And here when the Buddha says food, he means both food for the body and food for the mind. Food for the mind includes things like contact at the senses, consciousness at the senses, and intentions. Our mind feeds off of these things. This is why when people go into sensory deprivation tanks, the mind starts getting really weird. It's starved for food. And just as food outside can be either healthy or unhealthy, there's also healthy and unhealthy food for the mind. Especially with intentions. Our mind has a tendency to feed off of unskillful intentions, and even though they might be delicious, they're like some kinds of tasty but unhealthy food, in that they lead to trouble down the line. So we have to learn how to eat properly by finding the right kinds of intentions to feed on. But even then, as long as the mind is in the position where it has to eat, it's going to suffer. As the Buddha said, suffering is the 5 clinging aggregates, and the word for clinging upadana can also mean to take sustenance, to feed. When you're in a position where you have to feed on things, no matter how good they are, you're in an unstable position, always concerned about how much longer your source of food is going to last, dependent on things that are often outside of your control. The Buddha's solution was eventually to find a state of mind nibbana that doesn't have to feed on anything at all. There's no hunger, no lack. And when you don't have to feed, you don't have to hold on to anything. You no longer count as a being. This is why when the Buddha was asked, when arahants die, do they exist? Do they not exist? Both? Neither? He wouldn't answer, because we people are defined by our attachments, defined by our desires. When there are no attachments and no desires, there's no definition. We can't be measured by anything. When there's no definition, nothing to measure, there's no proper way to give a description. This is why the image the texts use to explain the Buddha's silence here is of the ocean. It can't be measured as to how many buckets full of water it contains. In the same way, an arahant can't be measured. But, to get to that state requires that we feed in the meantime. This is why, when the Buddha talked about the practice as being like having a fortress in a frontier, and he compared various aspects of the practice to different things in a fortress like mindfulness being the gatekeeper, persistence being the soldiers, discernment being the wall, he compared concentration to the stores of food kept in the fortress. When you get the mind to settle down and stay with one object with a sense of pleasure, a sense of rapture, that's food for the mind. Your gatekeeper of mindfulness can feed off of that. The soldiers, your persistence, can feed off of that. This is how they get their strength to keep going. Ajahn Fuang's analogy is that the practice is like an engine, and the engine needs lubricant in order not to seize up and burn itself out. The lubricant here would be the sense of pleasure and rapture that comes from concentration. So, the pleasure of concentration is a good thing. Sometimes you're warned that you're going to get stuck on it, that it'll make you go slowly on the path. And while the Buddha did recognize that it is possible to get so pleased with your concentration that you get lazy, he also said that the dangers of concentration are nothing compared to the dangers of not having concentration. When you don't have concentration, then no matter how much you may understand the drawbacks of sensuality, you're still going to go back to sensual pleasures. And it's because people are attached to sensual pleasures that they can kill, they can steal, they can have illicit sex. They lie. They take intoxicants. People don't do any of those things under the power of concentration. Concentration gives you an alternative source of well-being with none of those drawbacks, and it can keep you from hungering for your old ways of eating. So, learn how to focus on your breath in a way that gives rise to a sense of pleasure, gives rise to a sense of fullness. You can try long breathing, short breathing, fast, slow, heavy, light, deep, shallow. Any combination of those. When you've found something that feels good, stick with it. If it doesn't feel so good anymore, you can change. Keep on top of the needs of the body. When you're able to maintain a sense of well-being, then you can let it spread through the body. Think of the in and out breath connecting with the breath energies throughout the body, so that your entire sense of the body gets fed with a feeling of well-being, as you breathe in, as you breathe out. And as for people who say you're stuck on concentration, well, it's a good place to be stuck. Let them say what they want. After all, the Buddha was in concentration when he gained awakening, so you're in good company. Simply be careful to feed off of your pleasure carefully. If you gobble it down, in other words, you get so attracted to the pleasure that you forget about the breath that puts an end to your source of food. This happens all too often. You're focused on the breath, there's a sense of pleasure, and you just go for the pleasure, wallow in the pleasure. But the cause of the pleasure to begin with was the fact that you were focused attentively on the breath. That's your foundation. When you abandon your foundation, the pleasure may last for a while, but then it stops. And if you keep that up, your concentration practice doesn't really develop. You're like a person who gets a job and then, as soon as you get your first paycheck, you leave work, go off, have a good time, spending all your money, and then you come back to ask for the job back. Now, assuming that the boss is a kind person, he'll let you back. But if you keep that up, just quitting the job every time you get a paycheck, he's not going to give you a raise. You'll never advance in the company. In the same way, When you get a sense of well-being from just being with the breath and then you wallow in it, forgetting the breath, you get into delusion concentration, which is a dead end. In other words, you're here, but not really present. You're very still, but sometimes when you come out, you can even ask yourself, was I awake? Was I asleep? You're not really sure. That's delusion concentration. It comes from not knowing how to eat, or having no manners in how you eat. A person with manners doesn't gobble food right down. If you know that you get your food because of the service you're providing, you keep providing that service, and your food keeps coming. Here your service is staying focused on the breath, being conscious of the breath filling the body. Try to maintain that sense of full body awareness. It takes work, but the work you do in the sense of well-being is what keeps you clearly here with the breath. If, as the breath gets more and more refined, your range of awareness is small, then you disappear. It's like falling into an air pocket. You drift off and lose your concentration. The mind may be still, but there's no mindfulness. So, do the work that needs to be done. That way, you'll have a source of food you can draw on all the time. As you get used to this food, you then start thinking about other things the mind could be feeding on, and you begin to lose interest. This is much nicer, much less harmful than all those sensual pleasures out there in the world. At the same time, as you develop more refined tastes like this, you get a more refined sense of what's going on in the mind. This is why concentration is a basis for discernment. That's because you have to be very careful not to be overcome by the pleasure in order to hold on to the perception of the breath, which gets you more and more sensitive to the process of perception and thought fabrication in the mind. You can also begin to see how these things can contribute a little bit of stress to the mind. Even a sense of well-being like this can contribute a little bit of stress. And there is stress in the concentration. You sense it most as you're getting used to it, but then as you get more and more proficient at doing it, sometimes you tend to forget. But there is stress there. After all, the word jhana is related to the word jhati, a verb that means to burn. Pali has several different words for burning, and this is the one for burning with a steady flame, like the flame of an oil lamp. It's still, it's steady. You could read by it much better than you could read, say, by a bonfire. In a bonfire, the flames are leaping around, flickering here, flickering there. It's hard to read by them. But when the flame is steady, you can read by it. In the same way, when your mind is in jhana, you can read your mind. But nevertheless, it's burning. Ajahn Lee says it's a cool fire, but it's still a fire nonetheless. You're feeding off a fire. Remember that the meaning of nibbana is that the fire goes out. So, there's more work to be done to figure out what in the mind is still causing suffering, is still causing disturbances. It's hard to say suffering at this point, but it's still causing disturbance, even in a state of stillness. It's in pursuing this question that you finally get free. But you pursue the question in the framework of the concentration. Some people say, well, I've done concentration, now I need to move on to something else. But if you're going to gain insight, it's going to be here. Either right while you're in concentration or when you've just come out. So give your concentration a lot of time. After all, it is the heart of the path. After the Buddha had been practicing his austerities for 6 years and saw that they were a dead end, he asked himself, is there another way? And he remembered a time when he was a child and had spontaneously entered the first jhana. Something inside him said, that's the way. Even though right concentration comes at the end of the list, the factors of the Noble Eightfold Path, it was the first factor the Buddha discovered. Then it was simply a matter of his figuring out what other factors needed to be added to make it a complete path. There's one sutta where he says that right concentration is the heart of the path, whereas the 7 other factors are its requisites, its supports. And this is it, the mind centered right here. It was right here where the Buddha gained awakening. His mind was in concentration. We know he gained awakening under the Bodhi tree, but that's far away. The place where he gained awakening in his mind was right here in right concentration. So if we get into right concentration, we're in the same place the Buddha was. This way, we give ourselves a chance to see the things he saw, understand the things he understood. So, don't be afraid of being attached to concentration. As the Buddha says, indulge in it. Settle into it. Make it your home. Just be careful to have manners in how you feed on it. Otherwise, it has no drawbacks at all. In harmony with the teachings of the Buddha, we emphasize the profound importance of sharing wisdom far and wide. Presently, we've made this extensive 1,000-page work accessible through audio format. The responsibility to further this noble cause now rests with you. Through your subscriptions, likes, and the sharing of our content, you play a central role in the broad dissemination of these teachings, which can benefit numerous others. Let's continue the timeless tradition of spreading knowledge and nurturing mindfulness for the betterment of humanity. We wholeheartedly invite you to join us in this endeavor, and together, we can make a profound and positive impact on the lives of many.